Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who are reincarnated into this life with a soft voice and flabby soul. Each month we spin the wheel and land on a different genre, topic, or author. And right now we are reading through Occult Detective October by knocking off every one of these stories in The Complete John Silence by Algernon Blackwood. I'm Zach, and this week I am really interested in, I don't know, IP. You know, like how to make a kind of franchise story. I don't know a better way to talk about this, but to slot a story into a franchise where the title character is but kind of like a passing afterthought.
I'm Bob. I drank a lot of coffee and went to the gym, so if I pass out, just keep it rolling, Zach. This story was so rock and roll. I thought this was absolutely great. I'm interested in how Halloween it is, and it's the perfect story, I think, for Occult Detective October. It is my favorite so far that we've read in John's. I mean, it's the second story, so that's kind of stupid to say, but it's really good. And Chris, this is your story. You have to read this.
Yeah, previously we covered Hagiwara Sakutaro's The Town of Cats with Chris of Liminal Spaces. That was part of our read-through of all of the stories in the Weird Anthology by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer. Really, really interesting story, and pretty much the exact same concept as what we just read here in Blackwood's Ancient Sorceries.
Yes, exactly. Therefore, Zach, especially Atop and Living Dead Envy, if you are reading this too, please let us know if we're on the wrong track. But I did some research, Zach, and so
Okay.
Sakutaro Hagiwara's story comes out in 1935, I believe, and this comes out in 1908. Now, we don't have for sure, at least I couldn't find any proof that he had read this story by Algernon Blackwood. However, I mean, he was, I think, an English major studying, so he could definitely read in English. I was wondering, when did this story actually get translated into Japanese? And as far as I could find out, it's not until 1976 with, see if I can remember my Japanese lessons, Zach, Yokai Bosu, I can't remember the Japanese, Yokai Hakusei Jun Sairensu. So it comes out in 1976, and I think, he died well before that, but I think he probably read it in English. And I think the stories are so similar that Town of Cats might be an homage to the Ancient Sorceries.
I could even see this being like a case of parallel inspiration. Like it's a concept. You know what I mean? It's a hell of a concept. You like cats. Well, what if there was a whole lot of cats? What if there's a whole town of cats? These kinds of stories are, I don't want to say they're unheard of. I mean, you and I together have read, we did an audio episode on Cat Country, the Chinese novel by Lao Shi that was published in 1933. So 2 years before Town of Cats. But, of course you'd have to really like pull out some Da Vinci Code stuff. You'd have to pull out some red string on the cork board. Did this story get translated to Japanese and brought over, across the ocean, or was the English story translated into, anything could have happened, or it could have been a kind of parallel inspiration, or even, occult detective, occult stories, maybe a kind of telepathic cross-globular creative channeling of these other authors' work. I don't know what happened, Bob, but we should be concerned.
Yes, we should all be concerned about cross-globular happenings. But Zach, call me Michael Caine, because both towns, they're run under a kind of thread. There's an aesthetic law to both towns, and there's such a devotion to appearance. If you step out of line, something's going to happen. So in this story, I love Vizan. I think he's just a great character. I want to talk more about him, but he is very nervous, just like the character in Town of Cats. And I think when we see the cats appearing as silhouettes in the windows and then jumping out, being half human or whatever they are, humans or cats, jumping out and flooding the street in that same instance, it's extremely similar. So it had to be almost like they're vibing on the same wavelength, or he read it. This story, I think, is so fun. And when we've read a lot of the weird stories, sometimes I don't really care about the protagonist. I just want something weird to happen. I'm just waiting for that punchline at the end, or the universe to just explode in front of my eyes. But this was great, especially with the protagonist, Vizan, who goes to this town. he feels like an outsider. He just decides to get off the train. He has this idea of, okay, I'm going to hop off the train here in this little town in France and just wander around. And he feels like an outsider immediately. He's like, why is nobody paying attention to me? That's really strange. I'm not from here. They should be noticing. And he's like, wait, everyone's 100% noticing me. They're just all deliberately not looking at me. Little things start to happen. He starts to fall in love. He starts to fall in love with the city. And then he starts noticing everyone acts a lot like a cat. It's concerning,
Yep.
but wow, I thought this whole journey with him as someone who is so nervous, someone who is cloaked in shyness is how he's described. And while he's telling John Silence's story, he even doubts himself and he keeps looking at them for them to laugh at him. I thought, what an interesting character narrating the story that happened to him. He knows no one's going to believe him. He knows no one his whole life has ever taken him seriously. And now he's the protagonist of this crazy story.
Yeah, Vazan's great. I the first read through, I think I was more confused about the structure. Like, why is this a Vazan story and not a John Silence story? But the second read through, I was really relishing all the ways that Algernon Blackwood characterizes Vazan just through simple adjectives or like describing the way he does things. I mean, I read off a couple of these at, the start of the episode, but he just offhand mentions that he has a flabby soul. Or he talks with a small voice. And to quote a whole paragraph here, it subdued him more than ever, so that the tale became a lengthy apology for an experience that he deprecated. He appeared to excuse himself and ask your pardon for having dared take part in so fantastic an episode. For little Vazan was a timid, gentle, sensitive soul, rarely able to assert himself, tender to man and beast, and almost constitutionally unable to say no, or to claim many things that should rightly have been his. He's soft and gentle, and so what's so fun about this story, and I think fun is really the right way to characterize it, is we come to find that he's kind of like the reincarnated, he's like a reincarnation of a sorcerer, a very lusty sorcerer from ancient times. And the contrast there is so delightful.
It is. He's got this thing deep down inside him, and that is a part of, it's like a transformation story. Not just, okay, he's getting too involved in these occult things, but something inside of him that's very exciting is happening, but it's also like, we can't let that happen. It's going to tear him apart, or it's going to be evil. But I think he feels both a transformation of the entire town, because it's like the town of cats. It's vibrating at this very high pitch, and if it's something is going to emerge, but then something also is happening internally in him that's going to emerge. And he gives this really great description of himself to Dr. John Silence as he's saying, I felt like I was kind of a part of it, but also being forced out of it. I felt like I was extremely attracted to this place, but I also felt like I was extremely disgusted by it. And then he says, I almost felt as an unwelcome foreign substance might be expected to feel when it has found its way into the human system and the whole body organizes itself to eject it or to absorb it. The town was doing this very thing to me.
A foreign substance in the town. We just recorded an episode on Shirley Jackson's The Summer People. And that story, which if listeners have not read that, please just turn this episode off and go read that story. But basically it's these two out-of-towners who are cottaging for the summer. But they decide that they're actually going to stay just like a month later. They always leave on Labor Day, but they're going to stay a month later. And basically the whole town, which is previously so kind to them, just rejects this proposition. They're just like, no. And the story kind of devolves from there into essentially the town conspiring to kill them. I mean, it's a lot deeper than that, but essentially they are so rejected by everyone who, is such this charming, idyllic town that suddenly everyone's like, no, you have to go. Anyways, my point I'm trying to say is, this is not a scary story by any stretch, but it plays off of the same kind of horror trope, uncanny trope, where this thing, which is so common and charming, suddenly becomes strange and unwelcome. Actually, Freud would call this the uncanny, the unheimlich, where this thing which felt familiar, it felt like family before, is suddenly strange and unwelcoming. And that's exactly the atmosphere that we're playing with in this story and the other one I mentioned.
Sometimes I eat too fast and I feel very unheimlich. Sorry, that's terrible. So, for instance, I had a hamburger today. Anyway, this is, yes, I think it does have that very uncanny feeling. And it's different from Shirley Jackson in a way because, yes, they are rejected. Imagine telling someone that too. My God, the place where I stay in a cottage for the summer tried to conspire and kill me. I'm sure it was deeper than that, but they did. This, I think, he is going to, the town wants him. It's not just that it rejects him, it wants him, but it also dislikes him. And I think what it's trying to do is like kick out his current version of himself and manifest that old one that, he's the reincarnated version of this sorcerer. It wants to bring the sorcerer out in him. And so while it's rejecting his current whatever he is, it's also encouraging him. And I think there are little weird, in addition to everyone like being cat-like, things happen around him that make him feel more and more comfortable. So while at first he's like, oh God, I don't belong here, they start like little gifts start showing up. He gets like nicer dishware, a nice basket. These little gifts are showing up all around him to make his life more and more comfortable. And then he says, even as that happens, he says the mood of the town was reproducing itself inside of him. So the town is starting to take him over. It's not rejecting him anymore. It's not going to kill him like in Shirley Jackson. Now it's almost like it's infected him and now it's living through him. It's like a virus that is going to bubble up this old sorcerer.
Yeah, it's like casting a spell, really. It's enchanting him. And there's twice, actually, there's a bit of, I don't want to say foreshadowing, but the way that Blackwood describes the town. The first time he says something like, it was as though he was walking through a dream, but had not realized that he was dreaming, or had not yet realized, because there's this foreshadowing that, will come to realize it. And then the other one was like, a spell that he had not realized had been cast, was his experience of that town. But I do think that you're right that, there is a rejection of his previous personality, or maybe trying to scrub it away in some sense to clean it off. But what I think is so uncanny is the realization that people are not what they seem. And there's a couple ways that happens. That is, the obvious way in which they're constantly described as doing cat-like things. And then, lo and behold, they are in a sense cats, or they are doing, metamorphosis into cats. But the other aspect is the idea that the people, when you go to a small town, you see people living their everyday lives. People are moving around on tracks. They're going shopping. They're going to the laundry. They're going to the baker. They're getting groceries. But he realizes that no one is actually doing these things, or rather, no one is doing it because they need to. They're doing it because they have to. And while they're doing this, they're all subtly watching him. It's very Truman Show-esque, people having these conversations, but then kind of glancing over at the main character.
And as the catamorphosis takes place, he starts noticing more and more, they're always watching. And the way that they enter restaurants even is strange because they choose seats like cats. People will enter a restaurant and they'll kind of side over by the wall, and then they'll go to another wall, and then finally they'll just rush to a table and take a table. And so he finally starts figuring out, okay, this is really odd. What on earth is happening? Maybe I should get out of here. And at this point, when he realizes, okay, I'm getting comfortable. Oh no, I need to get out of here. That's when he meets the daughter of the innkeeper. And that's when he's really stuck. He's like, I can't leave anymore. Vazan has been so shy. He's never dated anybody ever in his life. And now he's like, okay, this is the love of my life suddenly. I have to stay. And then she starts kind of teaching him. She says to him, I think this was very interesting. She says to him, I'm teaching you the real life. Something like that. She starts explaining who she is and who he is. And she says, okay, I summoned you here. You did not just happen to stumble here. I summoned you here, and I will teach you the real old life. Eventually, this becomes, a complete like witch frenzy. But at the beginning, it's just this beginning little love story that becomes very intense, very fast. And when it becomes that intense, that fast, there's no going back for him.
What I liked about it was that it wasn't just a pure sweet love story. Every time it describes her, it talks about him being Hans
The
Heinz
spider.
Ewers. Previously in the Weird Anthology, we read Hans Heinz Ewers' The Spider, which features a very similar kind of, monstrous femme type person who's attracting you, but ultimately has nefarious plans and end. In that story, of course, as you can guess by the title, she's a giant spider. She wants to, drain you of fluids or something. It's a little sexually graphic than that may be implied. But in this one, it's a very similar thing. She's simultaneously like attractive to him, but she's trying to pull him in. She's trying to make him remember who he once was. And in that way, his soul, his true self can resume, dancing with the devil in the pale moonlight with her for all eternity.
What do you think, too, of this? I thought this was very interesting when she does say that. She says, the real life I speak of is the old life within, the life long ago. What do you think of this? In a weird way, it reminds me a little bit of the Bradbury story we read where there are all of I think it's called the crowd. And when you crash, all of these people surround you and it's like, where on earth did they come from? And they just ensure that you die. But this reminds me a little bit of that. There are these people waiting in the wings. And then there are these old personalities, at least for Vizan and for a few other characters in this. There's these old personalities that seem to be waiting in the wings for people waiting for the right opportunity to take you over again. And John Silence says that at the end, too, when he's talking to this unnamed narrator or this other person who's listening to Vizan's story. And he says, okay, there are times when you run into someone or you go back into a city that you might have inhabited many, many years before. And because it has all of that energy, it sparks that up in you again. And he talked about that in the last story where he says, okay, if someone does a lot of magic, that magic, those incantations might still exist in the air in that location. This seems to be kind of happening, but it's with past lives.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting, the preposition that she used there. What was it? Inside or within or something like that. One of those words, the old life within. But the point I'm trying to make is she's not telling him to go somewhere else to find this past life or to go back in time to find this past life. The past life, the past self exists within the self. And I think that ties in nicely. I mean, I don't think I'm quite ready to try to give a grand theory of how Algernon Blackwood's magic and, metaphysics work, but it seems to me that the denouement at the end, where John Silence says he didn't think it really happened, that it was all kind of a fantasy. Well, the first time I read that, I was like, oh, this snooty guy, he thinks this guy's lying. He thinks that, it was all a daydream or something like that. But actually, the second time I read it, I was like, no, he's saying that these things didn't literally happen in the material realm. You know what I mean? They were a kind of, so like the girl exists, the innkeeper's daughter exists, but it wasn't the innkeeper's daughter who was communicating with him. It was some aspect in the spirit of the innkeeper's daughter that was communicating with his spirit. I guess it's hard to put all this together. It's not laid out explicitly, but what do you think of that reading? Do you think I'm on the right track? Does that mesh with yours?
I think you're right, but there's a little hint at the end too that maybe it all was real, because they say, well, Vizan still has so I'll say it like this. Vizan at the very end is like really embarrassed and they're like, is there anything else you want to tell us? And he's like, okay. And then he shows like his neck and there's almost like a vampire bite. There are these red marks from when this girl who's a witch, who was a witch in the past, is still a witch in the future. But when she touched him, it left these red almost scars. And so John Silence says, well, it's probably just a nervous rash. I mean, it always happens with people who have these experiences. They have this dream, they think they go back into this long past history, and they end up with this nervous rash. But his has been on there for like a month. That's really unusual. Usually it's just a few hours or a day. But oh well, and they move on. So there's a hint that maybe it all really did happen. John Silence goes back and finds out Vizan just left. Vazan tells him, I just had all these crazy things and then I just went down the path and then that was basically the end of my story. But when Dr. John Silence goes back to that inn, they tell him, he never paid. We still have his bag. What the heck? So I think there's a little bit of an opening for maybe something did happen, and at least it didn't really transform Vazan, but there's still a threat out there. John Silence recognizes that something could still happen in the future.
I think that the point of this is not to make Bazan seem foolish. You know what I mean? Like
right,
by the end of it. And I think that we're gonna talk in X-Files right now. I think John Silence, the character, is not a Scully. You know what I mean? He's not there. And in both the first story and in this one, he's not there to be the voice of scientific reason, to be the materialist, to be the one who's like, it can't possibly be that. There has to be a scientific explanation. That's not him. But I also don't feel like he's exactly Mulder either. You know what I mean? He seems to be like Mulder 80% with like a 20% like, well, maybe I should say like, he won't just believe anything. You know what I mean? He's not the kind of guy who goes to the checkout stand at the supermarket and sees, a tabloid newspaper that says, Bigfoot fathered my children, and says, oh, yes, that's real. You know what I mean?
Well, he doesn't. He tells us that in the first story too. There's a lot of esoteric stuff that he's like, yeah, the idea is right, but you don't need necessarily all of the knickknacks. They help you get into certain practices that you can do. But he's like, divination, okay, you don't have to get all of these things. Telepathy. It kind of works. You don't want to always be reading someone's mind. You can kind of use it in different ways. But he is invested in these things to learn them, and then he is not just always accepting anything. And I think he's willing to believe Vazan from the very beginning. He never doubts Vazan. It's only Vazan doubting himself. And John Silence says, no, we're here to listen to your story. We're buying into the story. And I think he might be almost like somewhat Jungian in this way of like, well, if we're going to listen to the patient, we can treat anything they tell us as something like a real psychic phenomena that actually happened to them because it has affected them so deeply. So if they say that this happened to them, we're going to treat it like it's a real thing in their psyche. So I think he is willing to believe Vazan, knows Vazan was actually there, and even leaves the possibility open for this idea that it was a dream may not be true too, but he's not telling that other person in the room that.
I'll have to go back and double check this, but I wonder if there is a difference between the way that John Silence talks to the reader and the way that John Silence talks to Bazan. Because you notice that at the start of the story, you were mentioning that John Silence really endorses what Bazan is saying. He says he's told it again and again, and you can tell by the way he talks that it's, he's speaking with utmost truthfulness. He's not lying to you. He's not embellishing. But by the end of it, what he says is essentially something to kind of deflate it. He gives very calm, rational explanations. Now, the difference between those two is that at the very start, John Silence is addressing the reader and saying, oh, believe Bazan, this happened. At the end, John Silence is addressing Bazan. He's saying, calm down, you flabby soul. Calm down, you weak voice man. Like, I'm sure it was all just a nervous tick. I'm sure there's a rational explanation for this.
I think you're right, because we have this third person who maybe is kind of a stand-in for us. We don't really know who this person is. In the first story, it's Mrs. Svensson, who is just described as the Swede in the chair. But in this, it's just someone who happens to be there. And he tells him, okay, this is a dangerous thing that's happened. He tells Vazan, don't worry too much. But then he says, subliminal uprushes of memory like this can be exceedingly painful and sometimes exceedingly dangerous. And then I only trust that this gentle soul, Vazan, may soon escape from this obsession of a passionate and tempestuous past. But I doubt it. I doubt it. So there's still a danger for Vazan, even though he's telling him it's going to be okay. Zach, since this is a cat town, I think we need to talk about the cats, because I loved the cat part of this. There's all the weird behavior of the humans who are acting like cats, doing weird cat things. There are the strange cat phenomena that happen, like the free gifts. But then I think there's one of the best things is this band in this public garden, this public square, and he hears it and he's like, That's very beautiful. It's very relaxing, but what on earth are those instruments? And he says, it sounded like a chorus of animals, of wild creatures somewhere in desolate places of the world, crying and singing as animals will to the moon. He could fancy he heard the wailing, half-human cries of cats upon the tiles at night, rising and falling with weird intervals of sound. But it's all of these people with regular instruments, and he says, what they're playing has no rhythm, it has no melody, but, it's kind of nice. I thought that was the best cat element. He compares it to Aeolian harps,
That's
and he
funny.
just watches.
That's funny. Yeah, if I had to imagine what a cat playing an instrument would be like, it would probably be pretty atonal and bizarre. Just judging by the way,
This is the cat piano. I think in addition to the cats, in addition to Vazan going through this transformation, one of the best things about this story is the love of a city, a brand new city where you're kind of so enamored by it. It's very romantic. You think, wow, first I don't belong here. It's too uncomfortable for me. It's too beautiful. I don't fit in. And then slowly you feel like, wow, this is like my soul represented in 3 dimensions, that I can wander around in. I think that was one of the best parts of this story. It's spooky. Obviously, that when all of the witches start coming, they go to the dance, which is very much like the Walpurgis night from Faust, where all of the witches are jumping around. One of the best descriptions is when the witch that he's in love with, it says, she grew to the size of a tree and shot in flames. That was absolutely incredible. There's even a Harry Potter Deathly Hallows like broomstick kind of chase. There's no broomsticks, but somehow these cat people can like fly by falling. There is so much, like you said, it's not very scary, but there's so much delightful spookiness to this story. In addition to the romance of the city, there is the absolute fun of Halloween and spookiness.
Yeah. And what I loved most about it was that it wasn't a story of like Bazan resisting the witches and resisting Satan, like that grand moment where it's revealed. He goes out, he joins her, and it's like, oh my God, there's Satan himself. And everyone's rubbing oils and ointments on each other to transform into cats. He doesn't reject it in any way. He's far too enchanted at that moment. And maybe not even like unwillingly enchanted. He's 100% there for it. He just trips and falls and misses the train, basically. And that's the only reason he got away, was that, what was it, the wall he was walking on collapsed and he fell down, something like that. But
he gets hit by something and they fall down, and then he gets up onto the wall. Yeah, because they're like weird fly falling.
Yeah. So basically, like, it wasn't like, it was merely happenstance that he wasn't totally carried away.
And I think, again, that's one of the best parts of Vazan. He's someone who is, as we said, cloaked in shyness. He doesn't really talk to anybody. He can barely finish sentences, and you kind of root for him. You're like, yeah, go to this metal concert and have a great time, Vazan. And he is having a good time, and it's just fun for him to open up. And then, of course, he ends up going, he wants to get away because a little bit too much, when Satan's dancing around, who knows to what degree you should get involved. But for Vazan, it's he's the perfect character for this, because you're right. He goes into it kind of wholeheartedly, and you feel like, wow, Vazan is finally letting loose.
I do want to talk about the structure a little bit, because we talked about it a little bit before, but this story is so different than the other John Silence story. The other one being a very kind of hero-oriented one, and this one being maybe something I would expect to find in like Chaucer or something. You know what I mean? Like the idea of John Silence is just kind of a frame in which this story can exist. So one of the things I want to keep looking out for in the future is try to determine exactly what Blackwood is doing with these stories. Is he giving us a hero, or is he giving us a kind of frame with which he can slot in all of his fantastical ideas that come to him? You know what I mean?
I'm excited to find our past lives, Zach. That's what I'm looking forward to, the next story.
Well, sign me up for hypnotic regression therapy. I'll talk to you later, Bob.
Hail Satan!